Well, good evening. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I'd like to call a special meeting of the Burlington Area School District School Board to order. And tonight we have one item on our agenda. It's the preliminary findings of our discipline audit. And Steve, do you have a couple comments before we start?
Thank you. Yes, good evening, everyone. I wanted to just start off this evening. I imagine that we all have a little bit of a piece of our hearts tonight that are with Waukesha and the tragedy they were hearing about from their holiday parade yesterday. And so I just wanted to make mention that recognizing the grief that and the pain and the horror that they're feeling right now, that we just, on behalf of all of us gathered here tonight in another school community nearby, that we offer our deepest condolences to the Waukesha community. So thank you for being here and for indulging me with that moment. Also, two other just brief things. Did want to mention to folks, I know that maybe depending on where you're seated, this may or may not be the ideal audio and visual for you. We did try to set this up so that you have the best view of the presentation, but also be able to still see the board, and knowing that we're trying to live stream and juggle some online technologies all at the same time. So just wanted you to know that we did the best we can. And then the third and final thing I'll say before we start is that I've heard a fair bit of thought around the idea of whether or not there was a presentation to be made available prior to this evening. And I'm sorry for those of you that really wanted that. You'll meet Dan here in a moment. And this is really his preliminary findings to the board and to all of you. We're all going to be hearing that at the same time. And Dan has really said that the written report that's going to follow eventually, that's something that will be made available. And certainly we can share his slide deck that I think he was changing just moments before as you were coming into the room. So just wanted you to know that that will be made available to you. We'll post that later this evening. And then any written report that follows will also be made available as well. So as we get going, there's just a couple of slides I want to mention before I introduce Dan. First is that as we sort of look at the discipline audit, I do want to remind folks that internally within BASD, we continue to focus on these three items. These have been our goals for approximately 5 years. The concept of our essential skills work, clear learning goals for students, our best instructional practices, and universal access. And certainly when it comes to a conversation about discipline, and in particular any students that are missing class time, that concept of universal access fits right in with our work, which has been part and parcel to our existence for the last 5 or so years. The other thing, of course, what brings us here tonight is we were issued corrective action from the Department of Public Instruction. I know that's not new news to those of you who are seated here. That came to us last year, albeit somewhat difficult to read. There were 4 different things that we were told we had to do. And so items number up here 3 and 4 are completed. I'll just briefly mention that item number 3 refers to our policies and procedures. And that is something that the board took action on November of last year as they were working through updating all of their policies and procedures. And so DPI did get that and said that that was completed and to their satisfaction. Number 4 was about reporting relative to administrative code, which again, we had been working with DPI even prior to this corrective action. We've resubmitted to their approval as well, and that is also complete. So the 2 things that we are then talking about relative to the corrective action have to do with preventing instances of discrimination and discipline. That's part of this audit. And then the second part is about addressing a racially hostile environment. And that is not an easy thing to do from the standpoint of saying, well, it's just something you check a box off or it's done. That's long-term hard work. But did want to remind everybody that this discipline audit is partly related to the corrective action from DPI. So as part of that requirement, number 1, as required by DPI, and we had to conduct a discipline audit. They had suggested Dan Lozen, who works at UCLA, and we have been working with Dan since about midsummer. We were providing him with the various different data sets that he was requesting, which can be a monumental task in and of itself. But certainly what we will hear from Dan, I would imagine, is going to be at least insightful and hopefully affirming to things that we already know, and hopefully not a lot of surprises. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and then we're all going to hear his presentation.
You can go ahead, Dan, now and share your screen.
Great, thank you all. And I really look forward to working, further work with the district to address some of these concerns and issues. I don't know if, let's see, if I can share. So this is, display. So a few things about me, but before I say that, yes, my condolences as well to all of you in Wisconsin. If you have any relatives or friends, just for the tragedies that have occurred recently. Some things about me that you should know. I was a teacher for about 10 years, an elementary school teacher in public schools in Massachusetts. I had my own struggles as a classroom teacher, especially my first couple of years. And with regard to discipline, and specifically, I was probably the only teacher sending kids to the principal's office pretty much every day until I received support and training from the school district at the behest of the principal, who was not suspending, in my case, the students, and recognized that I was giving up a lot of the power and I needed, by sending them to her rather than addressing the issues myself, and that I really just needed help. And fortunately, I was early in my career and open to all sorts of suggestions, and I just wanted to improve as a teacher. And the things, the kind of training I received really helped considerably. But since then, I went to law school. I studied education issues and civil rights, and I've had a chance now to work with states and districts all across the country, including some fairly extensive work with the state of Wisconsin and 26 districts earlier in the mid-2000s. And my goal with regard to working with Burlington Area School District is to really help the district create and implement an effective action plan as part of the discipline audit. So this is really the first step, and ultimately the goal of all this work is to improve educational opportunity and outcomes for all the students in the district. This presentation is, as Dr. Plank mentioned, a preliminary review of the discipline data, in part because usually when I work with districts, I also work with a data expert and have sort of extensive cross-checking of the information before I do a presentation. And there's a new discipline person, data person that's been either been hired or it's about to be hired. So I'll have that opportunity, but I didn't want to call something final until I've really had a chance to work with the district's data expert to make sure that there hasn't been some sort of mistake in terms of the interpretation. I don't think there are any errors, or certainly not of any magnitude, but it's always a good idea to have everybody on the same page, because this is a sort of a mutual problem-solving endeavor. The data I'll present today look at the discipline rates and disparities in 3 different ways to provide a more comprehensive picture, and I'll explain the rationale for each one. And the initial analysis suggests underlying issues that the district can address. But this is not a sort of, this is not causal analysis. I'm not assessing or evaluating or suggesting that I know what is causing the observed disparities or the rates to be high or low for that matter. So this is a collaborative effort. And as mentioned, this is descriptive data rather, I'm not looking at correlations or causal relationships, although the data can suggest that there is an area that calling for deeper reflection. And in some cases, there may be some disparities and rates that the district has a really good sense of what is causing them already. So that additional information, obviously, as not a member of the district, I don't bring to the table, but members of the community, parents, and administrators, as well as teachers, will hopefully share in the creation of the action plan, and so that it'll be well informed, not just by the data alone. But the questions that do come up that we can consider, even just looking at descriptive data, are things like, are the rates high and can they be lower? And what are good ways to look at disparities by race and disability status that can better inform the work going forward? And so here we go. So before we get into the actual data, I should also say, I believe there are these shared principles that will guide the work going forward. One of them is there should be no trade-off with regard to safety or the health of the school climate. You want all the students to be engaged in their schooling, to attend school, to receive instruction. We want to prevent misconduct and improve the conditions for learning. We want the efforts we want to see efforts that will reduce or eliminate any unjustified disparities, and that we don't want to deny access to academic instruction in response to minor forms of disruptive conduct, especially ones that are occurring outside the classroom. And finally, that the responses that the district puts into place should serve an educational purpose. And that includes things like restorative responses, other ways to respond to students' misconduct that will either help prevent it from happening or to get at the underlying root cause, to understand it better, to mitigate its influence. Okay, so the three different ways that I'll be looking at the data. One is looking at student suspension rates, and that's the number of students suspended one or more times. And in some places, in most places, I just look at in school or out of school suspension rates separately. The next one is the rate of suspensions per 100 students. So it's very similar, but here we're counting the number of suspensions, not the number of students. So we're counting suspensions and dividing that by the enrollment to get the rate of suspensions per 100 students. And the last one is very similar to that one, which is the count. We take the count of days that are lost due to suspension, and we divide that by the enrollment. And that gives you the broadest sense of how much instructional time is lost. And both the rate of suspensions per 100 and the rates of lost instruction can be further broken down by the reasons for the suspension. I haven't done that with the rates of lost instruction in this preliminary analysis, but that may be something we decide to do. But I did do it for the rate of suspension. So you will see some of the data broken down by the reasons. But let's go to the first one, which is the student suspension rate. And one of the reasons to look at this is so that the concern that just a few bad apples, so to speak, is driving these rates high is counteracted by the fact that we're only counting a student one time. But that same strength is also could be considered weakness So for example, we're counting Johnny, who gets suspended 5 times for 3 days each, as the same equivalent as Duke, who was suspended just once for 1 day. So this is that unduplicated count. That's what we mean by an unduplicated count. The student only counts 1 time, even if they were suspended multiple times, and there's no reflection on the length. But because we'll get there using the other metrics, it's a good first cut at the data. Another thing to remember is that, and this is true with all the rates, but especially with this rate, that if we're just looking at 1 year's worth of data and we're looking at a group that has very low enrollment, any one student can count for a very large percentage of their group's student suspension rate. So you hear here in this example, in this table, you can see that in year 1, there were 3 Native Americans enrolled. This is a hypothetical, this isn't actually your data. And if none were suspended, it would be 0% suspension rate. But the next year, in year 2, there's still 3 Native American students enrolled. If 1 was suspended, now we've gone from 0% to 33%, because each student would represent a third or 33% of the total enrollment. And so in this way, sometimes when there's a student group with very low numbers, the data are volatile in terms of the suspension rates. And the other examples are just similar, just to demonstrate that you could have 25 students enrolled, and 5 students would represent 20%. So each student would be counting more than 1%. The question is, if for example, in the example, 1 Native American student was suspended just 1 time, that's 33%. Is that a high rate? It might be an anomaly, or it could be indicative of a serious problem. And so we always want to consider the underlying enrollment when we're looking at a rate, say 33%. But we don't want to overlook that some small subgroups by race or disability status may have very high rates. And that's why it's important to look at the data over several years. And this way we can combine enrollments and counts of students being suspended to get a more consistent look at the data, as well as by combining the enrollment, by making the enrollment sizes larger, by say, as I will in moving forward, as you'll see, when we combine 3 years worth of data, we're actually at over 100 Black students, for example, instead of between 25 and 35 students. So one of the questions that researchers often ask is, could the high rate simply reflect the chance event? And yes, that the chance is always a possibility. And by chance, that means, if you randomly distributed suspensions, of course, no one really does that, but if you did, what is the likelihood you would get a rate of this magnitude? And so when there are very few students in a group, that likelihood is greater that you're going to get a rate like 33% or 50%. On the other hand, we're not testing hypothesis. This is not an experiment. We're not doing a causal analysis. We're just describing what is, and therefore it's important to keep that in mind. We're not drawing firm conclusions, but the rates that are described are the rates. They're not a sample, for example. They're not a sample of a population. They do represent all the students and all the suspensions and so forth. As I mentioned, this report it's not our intention that this ends my work with the district. And I'll leave it to the district administrators to describe exactly how my role might unfold, but the intention is that I'll continue to work with the data folks, or the data person that's hired, as well as the administrators, to help better understand what the data show, but also to think about how to look at the data moving forward over time. And I think we've already done that with the reasons for the 3-year suspension rates. Let's see. And so now we're talking about in the Burlington Area School District, the related concern would be that with fewer than 30 Black students in any one year, the experience of any one student represents 3 to 4 percentage points. But by combining the 3-year total enrollment, each Black student represents 1.2 percentage points when calculating the student suspension rate. And I should point out that the per year average is going to be very similar, but it's not identical to this combined 3-year suspension rate. And I do the exact same math and calculations for every group. And this also makes it not only less volatile, but easier to compare to state and national averages. However, those come from just 1 year's worth of data, because there's not concern when we're looking at these subgroups over the, with the enrollment size of the state or the nation, the concern about volatility doesn't exist. Let's see. This is what the data look like. The first set of columns is nationally. The second set is Wisconsin, the state, and then the third is your district. And so you might notice right off the bat that, I don't know if you can see it well, but the first column is Black, then white, then Latinx. And that's because consistently there were students in those groups that were suspended at least once during all 3 years, whereas other groups didn't. In many years, it was 0. And the subgroups are Black students with disabilities, white students with disabilities, and Latinx students with disabilities. So you have in each set, it goes Black, white, Latinx, and then Black students with disabilities, white students with disabilities, and Latinx students with disabilities. And so if we look at the Burlington area, you'll see that, for example, for Black students, it's lower than the national average and the state average, but it's still a very high rate compared to others in the district. And I would also point out that the state rate, Wisconsin is among the highest in the nation in most of these categories that we're looking at here today. So this just gives you a sense of the context of the Burlington Area School District. I would also point out that the rates that I was just describing are secondary students, middle schools and high schools. Most of the Burlington Area School District elementary schools had a 0% suspension rate for most years. I've excluded them from most of the analyses with the exception, and I'll indicate when I haven't. The exception is Cooper Elementary School, which did have some students suspended in some years. I think I made most of these other points, but the take-home message is that even though state and national averages may be higher, that it's still problematic when you look at the rates and disparities, especially for Black students and Black students with disabilities in the Burlington Area School District. And so that's what, now this focus, you'll notice on the right side, it says out of school, and on the left side is in-school suspensions. And so this was not represented in the national and state pieces, that was just out of school. And so that these columns on the right match what was presented earlier. But notice that for in-school suspensions, the rates are higher for every group, Black, white, and Latinx. I didn't include students with disabilities in the slide, but this is still a three-year sort of composite look. And we'll note that for Black students, nearly 1 in every 4 were suspended in school over the course of those 3 years. So that's certainly a large disparity, and compared to white students and Latinx students, it's just visual. You can see that it is quite different in terms of the experience that these students are having. Now, the thing about in-school suspensions to consider is there are 2 sides to this coin. On one hand, an in-school suspension doesn't leave students out of school unsupervised. There's also an opportunity to have more adult interventions to make sure that students receive their assignments. And the best case scenarios are ones in which the school district is providing, mental health supports and services, and maybe additional academic instruction, and using the in-school suspension time to really help correct or prevent further misconduct, but also help understand maybe what's underlying those issues and really provide some supports and services for students. Often, though, an in-school suspension is just a detention. So it depends on the district, and it may depend on the school within the district, what the quality of experience the student has when they're in in-school suspension. So it's not an automatic to assume that it's a lot better than an out-of-school suspension. And in other research, which I'll provide sites to in the final report, we've looked at the costs associated with in-school suspensions and found that they can be predictive of dropping out and other economic negative costs in the long term. But it really asks a question when we're looking at in-school and out-of-school suspensions. The probably more important question is whether some of these suspensions could be replaced by other responses, and I understand that the district is looking at these. The other positive to think about is that the slide I just presented suggests that the district is not jumping to out-of-school suspensions as their first response. So for every group that had out-of-school suspensions, it might have been different students, might have been the same students, but at least the first take at the data suggests that it's quite possible that students are first getting an in-school suspension and given an opportunity to correct behavior. Now, one of the things to think about is that if we go back to this, if the ratio of in-school to out-of-school is low, then it raises questions. Are the in-school suspensions really doing the work of deterrence? You would want, if this is going to be an effective in-school deterrent to more serious misconduct, then you would hope that this would be much higher than the out-of-school suspension rate. And it varies depending on, the degree to which that's the case varies depending on the racial group. So this looks at that ratio of in-school to out-of-school suspensions and found that the Black student in-school suspension risk was 1.5 times their out-of-school risk for suspension. That's the same as the student suspension rate. And for white students, there were 2 points, and for Latinx students, they were both similar, was over 2.5 times the rate of the the in-school rate was over 2.5 times the rate of the out-of-school rate. So that's something to think about. And moving forward, I would hope to look at other less punitive responses that I haven't had a chance to really explore, and to look at similar kinds of possible ratios. So this slide shows you just capturing the differences for students with and without disabilities. So when we compared in that initial slide you saw black students and black students with disabilities. Well, the difference was 4.6 percentage points. This is just looking at the out-of-school suspension rates. Whereas the difference between white students and white students with disabilities was 2.4 points. And for Latinx students, actually, they had the largest difference. So this is looking at within a racial group. And what this suggests is that for every racial group, it's much more likely that a student with disabilities had an out-of-school suspension compared to their non-disabled peers. This raises questions across the board about the quality of interventions and supports and services for students with disabilities. But to the extent that the quality of those interventions, supports and services may need strengthening, it may need more strengthening when it comes to what Latinx and Black students are receiving. These are, again, questions. This is not a firm conclusion, but these are things to explore more fully. And I remind folks that students with disabilities often need to have their behavioral needs met if they're to receive a free, appropriate public education. And that's not a matter of opinion, that is actually what the law requires. And so that students, it's important to remember that students with disabilities will have some of them will have behavior differences. And instead of saying that all kids should get the same responses, they really do require, in some cases, to have different responses. That's not true every student with disabilities, but some of them do. And they, for example, may need a behavioral intervention plan to address their behavior that's caused by their disability, or if it's just, even if it's not directly caused and not part of the diagnosis, they may need to have a behavioral intervention plan as part of their IEP, or if they have a 504 plan, they not only may need that, if they do need that, they have a right to receive that. So the law says you can't punish students with disabilities for behaviors that we know are caused by their disability, but we also can't punish them if they're not getting the supports and services that they're entitled to receive, and as a result of not receiving those services, we see misconduct. So those are two sorts of inquiries that need to be made. And so that's something that I would encourage the district to look at. So we can look at the policies and procedures that are in place, but we also have to look more qualitatively. So it's one thing to say a student has a behavioral intervention plan, but that plan might actually not be sufficient to meet that student's needs. And I have seen some behavioral intervention plans that are very sparse and not really individualized or responsive to the mental or behavioral health needs of the student. So it might be a plan on paper, but not, and I haven't looked at any of the plans that the Burlington Area School District provides. So this is just an area for further exploration. It's also important to remember that most of the misconduct that we're talking about, and I'll demonstrate this in a little bit, are for minor misbehaviors. Most of the time, it's not violence or violence with injury, although there are quite a few fights. It's important to remember that a lot of the suspensions are not for behavior that's, for example, posing danger to self or others, and is not necessarily drug or any kind of illegal or criminal activity. And the tendency is to think, well, if the student's suspended, they must have done something really, really serious, and that's not always the case. Let's see. The next way to look at the data is the rate of suspensions per 100. Once again, the data we're going to be looking at, I've added the enrollment for all 3 years and then added up all the suspensions. And I've combined in and out of school suspensions to get a rate of suspensions per 100. And this is susceptible to the few bad apples. So one student who's suspended more 10 times, now they count all 10 of those suspensions So that can skew the data. However, it does also capture if a student, for example, with disabilities is not having their needs met and they keep getting suspended, that might indicate a bigger problem. So the rates tend to be higher, but the volatility issue is, again, mitigated by looking at all 3 years together. And this is what it looks like, and this is just looking at the Burlington Area School District. So we do not have this data for state or national level compared to. But you can see that in Burlington, this is the first 3 columns are Black students, the middle 3 are white students, and the last 3 are Latinx. So Black students overall had a rate of 51 suspensions per 100 students. But when we looked at Black students with disabilities, it goes up to 108. And compared to the students without disabilities, you can see the large disparities. Now, similarly, in just relative terms, there's a similar pattern for each of the racial groups. But it's most profound for the Black students and Black students with disabilities. This is, and again, this is, in this case, we're looking at the schools that suspended, that use suspension. So this does include one of the elementary schools in this district-wide cut. Here is just an example. I have looked at every school that did suspend students. We don't have to go over all that, but you can see that just by inference, the high school rates, although they're disparate, they're not as high as the district rates, which means that part of what's driving the rates up is what's going on in the middle schools. The other thing to point out with regard to students with disabilities across the board is that suspensions, especially for minor violations of school rules, even though we don't want to have double standards, but when a student, if a student's misconduct or misbehavior is related to their disability in some way, we definitely want to provide the supports and services to prevent it from occurring or to mitigate it. And when a student, if you thought about 2 students who were kicked out just for being disruptive or failing to cooperate, now a student without disabilities doesn't lose as much when they lose instructional time, because students with disabilities, when they're in school, they also get occupational therapy and physical therapy and mental and behavioral health and supports and services. They may have a much harder time catching up. So the disparate impact along the lines of disability can be quite large. So it's important just to keep that in the background of our thinking about how we need to address these concerns. When I'll provide more data about individual schools and so forth, I can provide 3-year rates for each school, single-year rates, and so forth. So the last way to look at the data is to look at the days of lost instruction. And this is, again, similar to the suspensions per 100, but it really gets at what we care about, I think, as a former teacher. I think most principals and teachers understand the value of in-class instruction, and that denying education doesn't prevent the misconduct or to teach the appropriate conduct. So the answer when students are misbehaving isn't just to let chaos and not do anything, but we need more adult intervention and more time spent addressing and trying to get at the root causes of the misconduct to prevent it. And that doesn't happen when students are just out of school and losing instructional time. And the other thing is that there could be similar counts of suspensions, but if one group is getting much longer suspensions for similar offenses, that might show up in looking at differences in lost instructional time. So here we have the statewide rates for lost instructional time, just the state of Wisconsin. Oh, this should say secondary, there's one spelling there. This is elementary and secondary rate too. And you can see that it's quite high at the secondary level. In fact, there are some definite disparities of concern in elementary schools. But remember that in your district, you're almost at 0% for all your elementary schools. So the real issue is at the secondary level. And statewide, for example, the first column is all students and students with disabilities, then students of disabilities, but the largest was for Black students who were losing 128 days for every 100 enrolled. Now, here is the data for your district, and we see similar as patterns as we saw before, that Black students with disabilities are losing a lot more instructional time than either Latinx or white students, and Black students with disabilities are losing the most time of all. But across the board, if you compare the second set of the three columns to the right to the ones on the left, you'll note that for each racial group, it's at least, well, not for Black students, not double, but it's significantly higher, at least 50 more days per 100 higher for Black students compared to their peers with disabilities. And it's not quite as large difference in absolute terms, but it's more than twice as high for Latinx and white students. So this brings us to, we're getting near the end. One of the other things that's really important to look at is to drill down, to think about code of conduct, but also for each code of conduct, when there is a violation, how many days of instructional time are lost. And I did notice that some of the longest suspensions in your district were for e-cigarettes. And some of the others were for more serious offenses. But why did few of the suspensions of 5 days or more were for e-cigarettes? So that's something to think about. Is every day, and this would be for any category. I always ask, superintendents and administrators and staff in the community, can they justify every day of lost instruction in response to misconduct? In other words, if one day would serve the purpose that a suspension is supposed to serve, why are you assigning 3 or 4 days? And is this an automatic thing? So that's something to look at, and that's why it's important to consider that. And I haven't completed the analysis of days lost by reasons for offensive. What I'm presenting here is the similar category of the counts of suspensions per 100 by reasons. And this slide actually just looks at the share of how the suspension categories are divided up. So one of the largest over here is disruptive behaviors. Over a quarter of all your suspensions for things like failure to cooperate, being disruptive. There were many different descriptors that I combined there, but fighting was not included. So fighting was the second highest category, just over 23%, and certainly that's a more serious category. But there were other categories like aggressive behavior, pushing and hitting, but it wasn't fighting. And that was a large percent. And then I lumped together what I consider objective categories. In other words, it's objective, at least from the standpoint that if you find a weapon, it's pretty clear there's been a school violation. You find a student with an e-cigarette or with tobacco or that's been drinking, it's pretty clear that that's a violation. Where some of the other terms like disruptive or aggressive behavior, that is more subjective and more likely to have raise concerns about implicit racial bias or disability bias and those sorts of concerns, which this is something that we can explore with the district further moving forward. So this just gives you a breakdown, and then I broke it down by the type of offense and by the racial group. And the very top line, you can see what is each group's share of enrollment. So for example, if Black students are 1.3% of all enrolled students, if they were proportionately suspended for each of these categories, you would expect that they would make up approximately 1.3% of the group of students that were suspended for each of these categories. But in fact, for every category, we find that Blacks are overrepresented. And this just gives you a sense of in what categories and how many students in which category. And this also shows you for white and Latinx students, how that breaks down. And this is something to think about moving forward. And you'll notice that I don't know if it qualifies as, it wouldn't quite statistically qualify as disproportionate for white students, but the area where white students had a higher share than, if they're 68.9% of the population, they would be normally around 68.9% of each of these categories. But in the area of what I call the objective offenses, the weapons, the e-cigarettes, alcohol, drugs, paraphernalia included, they were 78%. So there were higher representation in these objective categories than other students. So let's go to the next slide. So there's more, work to be done looking at the amount of instructional loss by these offense categories, breaking it down by race and disability, to get a better sense of why students are being suspended, but it's also important to think about where. So until recently, I used to always think that maybe because I was that high suspending teacher, but I used to think that most suspensions were a response to classroom misconduct. But recently in my work with several districts around the nation, I'm finding that a lot of the suspensions, when we get to look at the location data, are for outside the classroom, and that's true in Burlington, in the Burlington area school district. So 68% of all the incidents leading to suspension over the last 3 years, this is over 680 incidents, were for behavior that occurred outside the classroom. And that's a pretty large share. And then I've broken down the numbers, which you can see. I don't have to go over each one of those. But most of them were on the playground or hallway, and there was a separate gym, the locker room was separate from locker. So I'm assuming that I put the ones that were just locker in with the hallway ones. That's the kind of thing that I'll need to go back and confirm with the district before I issue the final report. But you can see that a lot of issues on the playground. So this is also important with regard to the action plan in terms of investing in resources and training. It's important not just to think about what's happening in the classroom, but to realize that students are losing a lot of instructional time for misconduct that's not happening in the classroom. So trying to have the response not just address the sort of general school climate, but to really think about the location and think about interventions and responses that are maybe take that into account. And we can talk about all the different things, but restorative practices, for example, if it's destruction of property, but it's not in the classroom, it wasn't being disrupted in the classroom, a response might be to do some work to restore whatever you destroyed. If you use graffiti, maybe you have to spend some time painting over the graffiti that you sprayed on a wall. That's just a very straightforward example, but there are many, many. This is breaking it down into some other ways to look at it. So for the 328 incidents outside the classroom, 88 were fights, but 99 were still for minor misconduct, refusal to cooperate, or inappropriate behavior. So this means that there are staff outside the classroom that are intervening with regard to minor misconduct, certainly minor compared to acts of violence, fights, and that sort of thing. So I'm not meaning to dismiss this, but it does, it could inform what kind of action the district wants to take moving forward. And there's some other breakdowns, but I don't want to take up too much time. I want to leave some room for questions. One of the things when we looked at some of the racial disparities, it's important to note though, is that there were 53 or 54, and there was some question of how many. About 28% of the Black suspensions were from inside the classroom. 72%, so higher than the overall average, were for outside the classroom. And none of the incidents inside the classroom were fights. So this is just gives you a further breakdown. And there were 9 classroom incidents involving Black students with disabilities. That's 60%. 8 classroom incidents were for leaving class, disruptive or inappropriate behavior, including the use of a cell phone. So this also goes to questions of, are there other ways to respond to that misconduct, and were they explored? And these are the kinds of things that we can look more closely at, not just looking backwards, but looking forward. So I have already started to look at data that the district is collecting now for the first, third of the school year. But I didn't present that information, but I hope to have at least some preliminary findings to present in the final report. I want to make sure that the data are accurate, and I know that's a new data system, there's a new data person, so I'm not going to really speak to those, but it is important to look proactively, how are suspensions being used today, because a lot of the data I've presented thus far are they weren't from last year, they're from 2 years ago or even older than that. So one of the things in terms of informing the action plan is that it's going to be important to think about whatever you do, how it will address misconduct outside the classroom, and ensuring that the training that you provide, if there's a training component, would be for those who do monitor students' behavior and interact with students outside the classroom. It will be important to do a deeper review of the mental and behavioral supports and services. So the training should also include special educators. We shouldn't assume that because someone has a certification in special education that they necessarily have all the classroom management skills, for example, or the behavioral or are well schooled in how to provide behavioral intervention. Many are, but not necessarily. And as a former teacher, I know you can always improve and additional or newer training, new approaches, especially if that training may be needed. The drafter should further examine responses to misconduct, but also think about how resources are going to be used to address that misconduct. And if there are other kinds of things that could be done about these less structured times and places. The other thing is, I think there's a lot to learn from the educators at the elementary level, because for 3 consistent years, the rates of suspension were either 0 or very close to 0. So I know not everything is going to translate from elementary school to middle school or high school, obviously. But there may be certain approaches or ways of dealing or responding to misconduct that ended at middle school. And if so, there may be some ways to adopt what is happening in elementary schools for the upper grades. The other thing to consider, especially as we delve into the newer data, is that I'm hearing from districts that I work with or observe across the nation that There has been a lot more stress and trauma that both families and children are experiencing, obviously due to the pandemic. And these sort of adverse childhood experiences can affect behavior, and it seems like this may in fact be the case. Plus, teachers and their families, a lot of teachers may be more stressed out that additional health concerns. There might be a level of increased anxiety and tension in our school climate that may contribute to initial rise in the use of suspensions. Imagine being out of school for a whole year, coming back though, and then getting told you can't come to school, early in the school year, and that could even have more negative effects than it would have without this year of mostly not being in school. So these are all things to consider as we move forward. There's a lot of important information about things that you're already doing and how well that's working that needs to be sort of incorporated or at least reflected upon. There's also, and it's also important though, to be wary of what I call cognitive dissonance, which is the tendency to think, well, there's not really a problem here, or to resist change. And with the small number, it's true that small numbers of students from certain groups may be driving the rates high, but it's important to also think about what could be done differently. So even if it may not take dramatic changes, if lowering, again, the Burlington area school district isn't what I would consider ISIS spending, so there may already be tendencies and attitudes among educators that just need to be expanded upon, and making more effective use of some of the policies and practices that may have already started. Let's see. But I would also encourage the district, to really review again the policies and practices and consider them, replacing some of them, especially ones where if you can't, justify a longer suspension as a response to something like an e-cigarette or even a fight for that matter. If it's not serving an educational purpose, then what is the purpose of the student missing instructional time? And that's especially important to think about because most of the misconduct is not during instructional time, it's during unstructured time and outside the classroom. I think I've gone over most of these points. It will be important. I do encourage all districts that I work with to review the discipline data on a quarterly basis. In this case, it might be in thirds. Quarter or third is not critical. It's that there is a regular review during the year, not just waiting till the year ends. And that will give you an opportunity to make changes, including resource allocations for the years to come. Let's see. And I know that Burlington is engaging in the data review on a regular basis, and these things I've already mentioned. I know you're implementing restorative practices and that there are ongoing efforts to address things like microaggressions, and all that sounds great. So it's quite possible that either the rates are down or disparities have diminished. But even if they haven't, it does seem like that there's a lot going on that's on the right track that would eventually, pay dividends. So I'm going to, let's see. I think I've summarized most of these findings. So I think what I will do is just talk about some of the other components of the action plan that I'll conclude. It's always important to connect all the disciplinary responses to the educational mission, to identify as much as you can specific areas to target, to involve the community, all the parents, but especially community members who represent the kids who are most affected by the current policies and the disparities that we're talking about. There needs to be when you're changing policies and practices, there needs to be an opportunity for community input and ongoing reflection, to set measurable goals that are going to give credit for the progress, and to specify resources, which would include, I would encourage having an actual budget that's attached to the action plan, and then to be able to assess and track the resources to ensure that whatever changes that you're making on paper are really being fully implemented. I think one last thing is to think about the harm principle for all students. We want to reduce the amount of time that they're losing, the instructional time, without sacrificing the learning environment. And ideally, and research does support this, we can do both. There isn't a trade-off. In fact, the successful districts reduce suspension rates while improving academic outcomes, because students are spending more time in class, and the overall environment is more welcoming and more conducive to learning. There's some specific detailed recommendations I can go over, but why don't I pause for questions? I don't know. I have not paid attention to the time, so it's already been quite a bit. So, and I can return to some detailed recommendations as needed. So.
Do any of the board members have any questions?
Yeah, board members, any questions? Good. I have a question. Mr. Lowson, when you were drilling down the data, talking about the slide that there was a showing different racial groups, there was one category in the end that had 19.2%. I didn't follow that. This is the slide.
Oh, that would have been, I believe that would be their share of a certain category of offenses. I believe that's what that was.
Okay.
Let me see, I can share my screen again.
Yeah, that slide. So on the far right, what is the 19.2%?
Far right. Oh, this is not, this is share of enrollment. These should add up to 100. So this would be all the other groups, their share of enrollment that aren't. There was not consistent students suspended from these other groups. So that's why there were a couple, but they were sparse and they weren't every year. So I focused on only the groups of students that consistently showed receiving a suspension.
Okay, I have another question too. You talked
Should I
about.
stay at this? You want me to stay on this table?
No, it's related to a different issue, just a general question.
Sure.
You talked about training staff and behavioral interventions or alternatives to suspension. Will that be addressed in your report too? Like, I'm curious what other types of behavioral intervention. I'm not an educator, so I don't know.
Sure. No, yes. And because of my work with scholars across the country, in fact, there's a book, about half the chapters in this book, which I edited. I don't know if you can see it.
Something gap, that's all I can tell. Yeah, it's pretty fuzzy. Closing the gap.
It's closing the school discipline gap, but it's a compilation of studies of usually districts. I think there might be one state included, but to look at what works both in reducing suspensions and the disparities. But I can tell you that a couple of there's a recent report, I haven't read it in detail yet, on PBIS that was based on districts in Texas that showed some real effects, whereas prior studies of PBIS hadn't always shown a consistent, usually shows reduction of the use of suspensions, but it hadn't before recently shown consistency in reducing racial disparities. But one of the ways to measure the differences. I always say look at the absolute differences because we want the harm to be reduced for all students, but also look at the underlying rates at the same time so that we don't want to achieve proportionality by, let's say, increasing suspension rates for white kids. That just means more kids are being harmed. That makes no sense. So we always want the group that suspends most often, whether they're students with disabilities, Latinx kids, whatever the group is, to show real progress and to see a narrowing of the racial differences. But we don't ever want it to be one group at the expense of another. So that's and the study on PBIS, instead of looking at a ratio, a relative ratio, it looked at the absolute differences and did show a narrowing racial gap. There's another study on restorative practices that looked at how the restorative practices were actually implemented in the district. So this study was done by Wested, and the lead author was Sean Darling-Hammond. His mother happens to be the chair of the Board of Ed for the state of California. He's a researcher now at UCLA. And this study looked at the actual amount of restorative practices that students were exposed to. And he had, I think, 3 years of data for every student in the state of California. So it was great sort of data, and then the survey data to correspond with that. And found that the implementation of restorative practices, where it was implemented the most, it had the most benefits in terms of achievement. So that's the punchline. So it was proven both effective in terms of reducing suspension, but also improving achievement. And it counters the sort of, oftentimes there's the feeling like, well, if we suspend fewer kids, what about the quote unquote good kids? Shouldn't we throw out the bad kids so the good kids can learn? And that resonates with, I think, a lot of people, but when you look at the data, in fact, it's the high suspending school districts, the more we see suspensions, the tendency is that achievement goes down, graduation rates go down, that sort of thing. So it tends to be more detrimental than most people realize. And so that's an important thing to consider. So it is very possible to reduce disparities, reduce suspension rates, and improve achievement and graduation rates. Those things they go hand in hand.
You mentioned the acronym PBIS. I'm not an educator, so what is that?
Yes, I'm sorry to use jargon. That's on me. So my apologies. So stands for, and usually they say system-wide. So it gets more jargon, but positive behavioral interventions and supports. It's a tiered system of addressing behavioral concerns, and it's also used as sort of a mitigating factor to make sure that kids are getting supports and services they may need to be successful before they're evaluated for special education, for example. So usually there's a team, and there's tier 1, which everyone gets training in how to sort of reinforce positive behaviors in your classroom, in the school generally, and that's why they call it system-wide. It is something that everybody gets some degree of training, including cafeteria workers and playground aides and so forth. And then the next tier is a more intensive supports and services for students that aren't responding that well just to the general one. And then there's a third tier that's even more intensive. And at each tier, you should have smaller and smaller numbers of students. And it's just a way to ensure that the students that need the most supports to be successful are getting those supports outside of what special education might provide.
Board members, anything else? Jill, you have some remarks? Okay. Well, Dan, thank you for
Dan.
presenting.
You're very welcome. And again, if you do have other questions do occur, I am very happy to answer them and give them to one of the administrators, to Jill or to others. I'm sure they'll make sure that I get them to respond. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care. Anyone?
The chart says we're not. The chart says we're 74% better than the rest of the nation.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a meeting for the board, so no public comments tonight, so please.
Just some additional things that as a school district, we wanted to be able to share as the data used for the audit was from the 17-18, 18-19, and 19-20 school years. We did not want to use the data last year due to COVID, as the data would have been skewed in relation to that. Therefore, we just want to kind of share some of the things we have been working on in the last 2 years in relation to this. So one thing that we noticed right away within the data from working with Dan Lozen was we had over 99 different discipline codes within the system. And that is very hard for us to track accurately as to what's really happening in the system. If you recall him saying like disruptive behavior, there was a lot of different codes for that. So as an admin team, we narrowed it down to 14 different codes to try to streamline and be able to analyze our data more accurately when it comes to that. We also had a conversation behind referral entry. We noticed that we had some, if you saw on one of the slides, there's a spot that talked about the unknowns with a location as to where the discipline occurred. To us, that's a concern that we don't have it always noted accurately in the system. So we had a conversation around that and did some training with our staff to ensure that that is accurately measured and noted within our Skyward system. And then student note tracking was something else that we brought up as a thought that was really important to do. This one more so relates to if I'm at Dyer and a situation happens at Dyer, but it didn't necessarily lead to any discipline in any way. How are we ensuring that that information of concerns potentially between specific students is then shared with all of the counselors and administration at Karcher, and then again at the high school. So some of that gets lost in translation just with the change of schools. So we really wanted to firm up what that looks like on the back end so that we can ensure that there is accurate note-taking happening between buildings so that any incidences that do happen, we do have that understanding that when a parent says, well, this happened with the same student 2 years ago, we would have that information in the system moving forward. Another thing that helps with our improvements is part of why we redistricted to just assist with ensuring all of our buildings are more demographically balanced across the system. So that, as you all know, occurred this summer. All of our assistant principals are also working on looking at our student handbooks. We're working with Neola and really also pairing that with our practices here and really starting to analyze and have conversations about with each other across buildings in regard to what are we doing when it comes to suspensions, and a one-size-fits-all approach is not the approach that we want to take moving forward. We also worked on last year our special ed staff in grades 6 through 12. We started having more conversation around the need for the what's called SDI, specially designed instruction with special ed on a student's IEP. We had a lot of focus on co-teaching in the last few years, which really was a stronger emphasis on academics. And we realized that need to couple it with also students who have behavioral supports and needs on their IEP, and ensuring that we're also doing specially designed instruction to meet behavioral needs for students as well. that kind of goes to the students who are being suspended, who are special ed students. How are we ensuring that we're really providing strategies and supports for them so that we don't end up in situations like that? So that what we worked with CISA 2, and that just took place last year. We're also working on our grading practices. We've presented that recently in the last few months, where we're really working on separating our academics from our behaviors and ensuring that our grading practices are really to be informative and that we're not using our behaviors as a punitive approach to academics. So really separating that is also helping us. This summer, Dr. Plank and I also looked at some data platforms that we could be using. Historically, we have not had a data platform in the school district for us to really analyze our data in a really concise and easy format. So we decided to purchase what's called Forecast 5. We just purchased that in August. And we are currently in the stages right now of getting all of our data to talk to their system in order for us to utilize the data and be able to move forward and make more informed decisions at a more timely rate. With that, the secretary that was for the assistant superintendent has retired or is retiring. Noreen, she's been with the district for 34 years. So if you know her, make sure you congratulate her. She'll be retiring in the next few weeks. We have decided to replace that position with a data analyst. Really feel, again, that need for that data side to be within the school district. So that will really help us also moving forward when it comes to our data. When it comes to the stakeholder side of things, what we've been working on recently is we do have a share club at the middle school and high school. That is a group for students who feel marginalized or that their voices are not being heard, in order to have a place it's a safe place to go and to work with our staff in order to come up with ideas and strategies moving forward, so that all students have that sense of belonging at school. We also gave a microaggression survey to all students in grades 5 through 12 in the spring last school year. We use that data to really inform our staff and to understand where microaggressions are taking place. Our Share Club students were the ones that shared that they're really experiencing a lot of microaggressions at school. So therefore, we really wanted to understand where that was happening, how it was happening, how often, and then be able to use that data in order to improve the environment for all students. When it comes to the staff side, we did a trauma-informed care, which is around the ACEs, what that Dan was referring to. That was a few years ago with Dr. Thompson here in town. That was with all of our staff to make sure that our staff are really starting to understand the impact of home experiences and that trauma and how it can play out in school. We also have been working with the National Equity Project. We started that last year, and we had 2 different groups of 25 staff members engaged in training with the National Equity Project. We also are continuing to work with them this year, and they're coaching our administration and continuing to work with staff moving forward. And that really is building that insurance that all students and employees and staff have that sense of belonging, and really starting to analyze our blind spots and our biases as a staff. And then the last one that we're doing with staff is in relation to restorative practices. We are really seeing that need to shift away from punitive responses all the time with discipline, which is the mentality of a lot of school districts and how we were trained really to go about things. So we are really seeing the need to switch and move towards more of a restorative practice model. We intentionally hired Nick Ryan, who is our new middle school principal, who is a restorative practice trainer himself. We've also trained one of our elementary counselors this summer in restorative practices as well, so that she too is a certified trainer. And with that, we have a district committee of staff that are working with them so that we have someone in every building that really has that strong sense of understanding what restorative practices is. And we're also ensuring that all of our administrators are also very strong and understanding of the process behind the use of restorative practices as well. When it comes to the parent side, we just engaged and sent out a parent survey last week, I believe it was, right, Julie? Yeah, last week to families in the school district to be able to engage and start parent advisory groups, wanting to do that at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. The intent here is to really utilize our parent voice and really understand where they're coming from when it comes to our 3 C's and how they feel when it comes to the sense of belonging for them as parents, but also for their students. So what does it mean when we use the word compassion? What do you feel like we're doing well when it comes to compassion? What do we still need to work on when it comes to compassion? When it comes to commitment, same thing, and comprehensive, same thing. Hoping then to be able to couple with a community group and be able to move forward that way. So just wanting to share some of the things that we have been working on in relation to this topic, because as you all know, our biggest goals here in the school district are always to ensure academic growth and that there is that sense of belonging for all students. And we know that there is work to do. We are not perfect in any way, shape, or form. We know that there is things that we really need to work on. You just saw some of that, and we are eager to continue working on that for the betterment of all kids. Do you want to add, Steve?
Board members, any questions or comments?
I think that one piece that just was kind of sticking out in my head as we were going through this, that, and I don't know if you can add it to data, but parental involvement. I mean, we have disciplinary action on an individual. What was the parental involvement after that or before that or during that process? So I think that's a huge it's a huge question, because sure, we're certainly educators and we have an obligation to educate all students. But I think part of that dialogue is we're not the only people held accountable here. There's families and other people that should be held accountable. And if we don't have the information to help them become more accountable, if they're not, then that message should also be sent. Not just what did Jill do wrong, what did Steve do wrong, what did Kevin do wrong. How can we help the community understand we all share this responsibility in the involvement of making better students? We all should be held accountable.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah. Any other board members? Anything else on this topic? All right, well, I just want to thank the members of the public. I'm very pleased we had a large turnout. It's our first look at discipline audit. It's not our last. And I'm grateful we came. I understand people have thoughts they're going to want to express, and I'll remind you, December 9th is our public forum where you can come and make public comments. That's the time to present your ideas to the board. It's month 2 of our experiment of having a separate meeting for a monthly forum. So again, that's December 9th. It's a Thursday. But tonight wasn't a night for debate or public comment. It was just a night for the board to take in this meeting, but also for the members of the public to join us and also receive that information. So with that being said, I entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Motion's made and seconded. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
We're adjourned. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Interesting. He doesn't.